Shabbat Shalom. In my mind, it's easy when one is young and healthy to believe that God is benevolent and omnipotent. It's easy when one lives in America in the 21st century with a roof over our head, 3 meals a day, and as much clean drinking water as we could want, to believe that God is both all good and all powerful, all knowing, and that God interacts daily with our individual lives. But what happens when our lived reality differs from the biblical theology of God as abounding in kindness and acting with an outstretched arm? When one's health is threatened, when one faces profound loss, when one is lacking adequate food, water, and shelter, or when one faces oppression, persecution, murder, and genocide. How then do we begin to understand God? As we mark today the intersection of the reading of the Ten Commandments with the 101st birthday of my beloved grandfather Wolf Ruka, Zev ben Yosef, I am personally confronted again, as I have been throughout my life as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, with a theologically complicated intersection of blessing and curse. So as I read this morning in Parashat Yitro of God's saving power in the first of the 10 commandments, the 10 utterances, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, I would like to share with you my own personal wrestling in trying to understand God, what God is, and what God does. In Deuteronomy, we read, El emunah ve'ein avel, tzadik v'yashar hu, a God of faith without iniquity, righteous and fair is God. These are the words we pronounce, by the way, as we lay a loved one into their final resting place. And these are the words denied to my grandfather, not only in the murder of scores of his relatives during World War II, but these words are at the core of a faith denied to countless survivors and their descendants ever since the Shoah, the Holocaust, who cannot with a whole heart proclaim, El emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yashar hu, a God of faith without iniquity, righteous and fair is God. For half of my grandfather's life, he understandably challenged the notion of God as righteous and fair. After all, how could a God righteous and fair allow the murder of my grandfather's parents, siblings and spouses, nieces, nephews, aunts, uncles, and cousins? How could a God righteous and fair destroy the community of Częstochowa, Poland, in which my grandfather was raised? How could a God righteous and fair allow the genocide of 6 million Jews? How could a God righteous and fair allow a father to tell his son, as my great-grandfather, holding in his hand only his tallis and tefillin as he awaited the trains, told my grandfather, "Son, I will never see you again"? How could a God righteous and fair allow my grandfather to survive, but not his older brother who had accompanied Grandpa throughout so much of his time at the camps? A Holocaust survivor is justified in questioning the attribution to God of the qualities righteous and fair. And Wolf Gruka's frustrations with our Creator did not cease when Grandpa came to the golden land of America. After all, how could a God righteous and fair allow my grandparents and their young son to arrive on the shores of this great country only to be ushered into a makeshift apartment building repurposed as a shelter for the homeless? How could God strike Wolf Gruka's wife, my grandmother, Regina, with a debilitating muscle disorder that robbed her of her ability to move and force my grandfather 7 days a week to work caring at home for her at night, just as hard as he worked on the floor of the Chrysler assembly plant by day? For more than 75 years, my grandfather, Wolf, carried the heavy burden of survivor's guilt, and with it, the struggle, the brokenheartedness, in the thought that the faith which had brought him such joy as a child could be based on the entirely false premise of God's goodness and power and ability to act. Like water that can over time reshape even stone, 75 years of living as a survivor can ultimately bring healing and change perspective. In recent years, my grandfather's faith returned to him. As a centurion looking backward on his life, Grandpa began to uncover the hidden hand of God guiding him. In hindsight, Grandpa sees that it was God's help that allowed him to pass a test of life and death, reading the blueprints forced upon him by a Nazi commander written in a language my grandfather didn't speak. Grandpa correctly interpreted those blueprints, whereby the Germans determined my grandfather could be useful to their efforts and thus worthy of saving. In hindsight, my grandfather sees the hidden hand of a righteous God when my grandpa's lifelong dislike of dairy allowed him during the war to trade his small ration of butter for a little extra bread. My grandfather sees in hindsight the righteous God who gave him strength to jump from a moving train to illegally transfer from a British-controlled zone for displaced persons to an American one, where he ultimately met Regina, the woman to become my grandmother. My grandfather sees in hindsight the hand of a righteous God in sustaining him and keeping alive my uncle, then a tiny preemie that could fit in the palm of your hand through the challenges of the DP camps and then a journey to America. More recently, and not in hindsight but in real time, my grandfather beheld the righteous hand of God when one of his grandsons became a rabbi, and all the more so when that grandson assumed a position at a synagogue as large and as prestigious as Shaarey Zedek. My grandfather saw the hand of God when he found love again after the passing of my grandmother some 20 years ago. Over time, Grandpa admitted that his faith not only returned to him, but that God has become a frequent conversation partner of my grandfather's, as Grandpa sees and gives thanks for the many ways in which he is indeed blessed. The Jewish experience is to live constantly at the intersection of blessing and curse, and to try to make sense of that intersection. In Exodus, we read of a God who redeems. And in Deuteronomy, we learn that God is not only tzaddik v'yashar, righteous and fair, but also el emunah, a God of faith. Certainly we understand faith in God, but what does it mean that God too can be faithful? If you'll indulge me then a few more minutes, I think that just as my grandfather's faith in a God who is just and righteous returned in recent years, so too do I believe that God's faith in humanity returned in small part through the life of Wolf Gruka and through the similar lives of individual Jewish families around the world. Though it is only 8 decades since the end of the Shoah, look at how the Jewish people have responded in pursuit of justice and in the practice of righteousness. In this week's Torah portion, Parashat Yitro, we read the commandment to honor one's father and mother. Our rabbis teach that how we honor our parents parallels how we honor God. Over the last several decades, the children of Wolf Gruka, like other children of Jewish parents around the world, the children of Wolf Gruka stepped up to provide for him the way he provided for them for so many years. When children care for their aging parents, God's faith in humanity is restored. My mother, and by extension my father, has done more for Grandpa than any human could reasonably be expected to do for another. Mom, when Grandpa said that you appear to him with the face of his mother, though even as Grandpa remarked, you are much thinner than she was, I think that it was Grandpa's way of recognizing and thanking you for a love that transcends more than just a typical daughter's love for her father. You honor Grandpa to the extreme, and you provide for his every want and need. I pray that you know that whatever joy and dignity Grandpa experiences as an old man is because of your love and your untiring care of him. Uncle Joe, Aunt Sandy, and Aunt Sue, you two are each there in your own way for Grandpa. And the subsequent generations have followed suit, though sometimes we all laugh that possibly Grandpa loves his granddaughters-in-law, Rebecca and Brittany, even more than he loves my brother David and me. El Emunah, Deuteronomy says, God is faithful. Just as God's faith in humanity is restored by watching the children of Wolf Gruka care for him, so too do I believe that God's faith in humanity is restored by the way the great-grandchildren of Wolf Gruka are devoted to Torah and to Jewish living, just as you saw Caleb chant Haftarah earlier and Eyal lead us in Ashrei. I know that it brings incredible joy to my grandfather to see my kids leading prayers on this bima, the Shaarey Zedek bima, to hear them recite Kiddush on Friday nights in our home, to lead the Passover Seder with me each year, and because of Rebecca's modeling of intergenerational love, to make their Shabbat Shalom phone calls to Zadie each Friday afternoon. And I think we all found incredible joy in seeing my grandfather, the Holocaust survivor, standing next to Caleb, one of his great-grandsons, as we celebrated Caleb becoming bar mitzvah this last May. If you don't know that joy, look at my Facebook page and you'll see the picture of my grandfather with Caleb. I know, too, that God's faith was restored by the efforts to which my brother David and my sister-in-law Brittany went to bring into this world another great-grandchild for Zadie, to produce yet another descendant of a Holocaust survivor, and the extent to which our grandfather was overjoyed by the birth of his first great-granddaughter, Eliana, the one for whom so many prayed, and God answered our prayers. El Emunah, God is faithful. I know, too, that God's faith in humanity is restored by the tremendous love and respect that the Zedek family has offered to this Holocaust survivor and grandfather of their rabbi. My family and I are forever grateful for the kindness that so many of you show toward him and for the times you allowed him and me to share his story of survival with you. Jerry Fishman, thank you for bringing out the hugger in my grandfather. No one hugs like Jerry Fishman, and to see the joy in my grandfather's face when you gave him that hug, and give him that hug. Thank you to my whole Zedek family for being such warm friends to him and to us all. El Emunah, God is faithful. Just as Grandpa found renewed faith throughout his life, I pray that God's faith in humanity is renewed because of the acts of Wolf Kruka's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, along with the communities in which they choose to live and to serve, and the acts similarly of other children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, especially those descended from Holocaust survivors who stand up to take care of their aging parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Indeed, I pray that God's faith in humanity can be restored because of our own commitment to pursuing justice and offering compassion, to practicing righteousness and to strengthening Jews and Judaism and the state of Israel. Though as humans we struggle to understand how a benevolent, omnipotent, omniscient God could seemingly fail to act during the Holocaust, we likewise find incredible blessings in our daily life as American Jews in the 21st century, and we see profound miracle as well in the existence of the modern state of Israel. And of course, I invite everyone to stay on Zoom with me after services as I continue to explore God's role in the blessing and in the curse. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, we read this week. And El Emunah ve'ein avel tzadik v'yashar hu, Deuteronomy tells us. A God of faith without iniquity, righteous and fair is God. May the God of faith, who is without iniquity, who is righteous and just and fair, and who brought us out of Egypt then and continues to perform miracles for us now, bless the 101-year-old Zev ben Yosef, Wolf Kruka, that he may know health, joy, and pride each and every day. And may God bless this sacred family that is Congregation Shaarey Zedek. Let us say together, Amen, and happy birthday, Grandpa. Shabbat Shalom.